Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales. Tonight we drift far back to the very cradle of civilization, to a warm and dusty land cupped between two great rivers, a place the ancients called the land between the rivers. This is Mesopotamia, where the first cities rose from the mud, where the first words were pressed into wet clay, and where people first looked up at the wheeling stars and began to write down what they saw. Imagine a wide green plain under a vast and cloudless sky, canals shining like threads of silver, and tall temples of brick climbing toward the heavens. Here farmers coaxed barley from the silt, kings carved their names into stone, and poets told the oldest stories in the world. So much of what we take for granted, the wheel, the written word, the very hours of our day, was first dreamed up here, in this quiet corner of the ancient East. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is rest. Let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, and let the weight of the day drift away like a reed boat carried gently downstream as we begin our journey into the ancient world of Mesopotamia. Let's begin. Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers. The name comes to us not from the people who lived there, but from the Greeks who came long after, joining their words for middle and river into a single name for a whole world. And it is a fitting one, for everything about this place was shaped by water. Two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, flowed down from the mountains in the north and wandered slowly across a flat and thirsty plain before emptying into the sea. Between them, and along their banks, lay a strip of land made rich by the silt they carried. It was here, in the south of what is now Iraq, that the story of cities and writing and kings first began. The people of this land did not think of themselves as one nation. They were the folk of Ur, of Uruk, of Babylon, of 100 small worlds. But the two rivers bound them all together. To understand Mesopotamia is simply to understand what people can build when they are given water and time. The two rivers gave life, but they were not always gentle. In Egypt, the Nile flooded like clockwork each year, a calm and welcome guest that watered the fields and then withdrew. But the Tigris and the Euphrates were wilder and less predictable. Their floods came in the spring, when the snows melted in the far mountains, and they arrived after the harvest rather than before the planting, which made them more a danger than a help. Some years the waters were meager and the crops withered in the heat. Other years the rivers rose in fury, bursting their banks, sweeping away homes and drowning whole fields beneath the churning brown flood. To live here was to live at the mercy of the water, never quite certain what each season would bring. Perhaps this is why the people of Mesopotamia imagined their gods as powerful and sometimes stern, and why their oldest stories so often speak of a great and terrible flood. In this land, even the gift of life carried a warning. The first farmers turned marsh and silt into fields. When people first came to the southern plain, it was not an easy paradise, but a difficult puzzle. The land was flat, hot, and dry, and rain almost never fell in the growing season. Yet the rivers ran full of water, and the soil they left behind was deep and fertile. The great achievement of the early settlers was to bring the two together. They dug channels to carry river water out across the land, and they raised banks to hold back the floods. Slowly, patiently, they turned a wilderness of reed and marsh into some of the richest farmland on earth. A single field here, well watered, could yield far more grain than the same field anywhere else in the ancient world. That surplus of food is what made everything else possible. When a farmer can grow more than one family needs, others are freed to become potters, priests, soldiers, and scribes. From mud and water and patient labor, the first great civilization was quietly being sown. Barley, not gold, was the true wealth of the South. We often imagine ancient riches as heaps of jewels and glittering treasure, but in Mesopotamia, the real wealth lay in the granary. Barley was the grain that fed this world. It grew well in the salty soil where other crops failed, and it could be stored for years against a hungry season. From barley came bread, the daily food of rich and poor alike, and from barley came beer, which was drunk by everyone from laborers to kings. Workers were often paid in measures of grain, and temples kept vast stores of it as both food and treasure. So central was barley that it even shaped their mathematics and their sense of value. With debts and wages reckoned in baskets of grain, gold and silver had their place, of course, prized for their beauty and their rarity. But you cannot eat gold. In a land where the harvest could mean the difference between life and death, it was the humble golden grain, and not the metal, that truly ran the world. Reeds were the timber of a land almost without trees. The southern plain was generous with soil and water, but it gave almost no stone and very little wood. There were no great forests here, no hillsides of oak or pine, and yet the marshes grew something in endless abundance, the tall reeds that swayed along every waterway. The people of Mesopotamia became masters of the reed. They bundled them into pillars and wove them into walls, building tall and graceful houses that have scarcely changed in 6,000 years. They lashed reeds into slender boats that carried them across the marshes. They wove them into mats, baskets, and screens for every household. Even their writing owed something to the reed, for it was a sharpened reed that pressed the first words into clay. In a land that lacked so much, the humble reed became timber, boat, and pen all at once. It is a quiet lesson in making a whole world from what little you are given. The southern marshes were a world of water and birds. Where the two great rivers neared the sea, they spread out into a vast and shimmering wetland, a maze of shallow lakes, winding channels, and tall reed beds stretching as far as the eye could see. This was the home of the marsh folk, who lived much as their ancestors had for thousands of years, poling their narrow boats through the still water. The marshes teemed with life. Flocks of birds rose in clouds from the reeds. Fish crowded the channels, and water buffalo wallowed in the shallows. People built their houses on floating islands of woven reed, and gathered reeds by day to feed their herds and build their homes. It was a soft, green, watery world, humming with insects and alive with the calls of countless birds. For those who knew its secret paths, the marsh gave everything a family might need. Even now, this quiet landscape feels like a glimpse of the very beginning, when the first people learned to make a life among the reeds. Irrigation canals were dug by hand and guarded like treasure. The wealth of Mesopotamia flowed through its canals, and those canals were the work of countless human hands. There were no machines to dig them, only baskets, wooden spades, and the patient labor of many people working together season after season. A single canal might run for miles, carrying precious water from the river out to distant fields. And once dug, a canal had to be constantly tended, for the rivers carried heavy silt that clogged the channels and had to be cleared away again and again. Keeping the water flowing was so important that it shaped the whole of society. Kings boasted of the great canals they had dug. Priests offered prayers over the opening of the sluices, and disputes over water could set neighbor against neighbor and city against city. To control the water was to control life itself. In these humble ditches of mud and reed lay the true foundations of the first cities, quietly binding thousands of strangers into a single shared endeavor. Uruk may have been the first true city on earth. Long before Rome, long before Athens, there was Uruk. Around 5,000 years ago, this city on the banks of the Euphrates grew to a size the world had never seen, home perhaps to 50,000 people or more. Behind its great walls rose temples that towered over the plain, and around it spread fields, workshops, and bustling markets. Uruk was not merely a large village, it was something genuinely new, a place where tens of thousands of strangers lived crowded together, depending on one another in a web of trade and craft and worship. Here, many scholars believe, writing was invented, and here the very idea of the city was born. In the oldest stories, Uruk is the home of the mighty king Gilgamesh, who is said to have built its towering walls. To walk its streets would have been to feel the pulse of a new kind of human life, noisy, crowded, and thrillingly modern. In Uruk, humanity first learned what it meant to live as a city. Eridu was remembered as the oldest city of all. If Uruk was the greatest of the early cities, Eridu held a different kind of honor, for the Mesopotamians themselves believed it was the very first. In their sacred stories, kingship first descended from heaven to Eridu, and it was here that civilization began. Set at the edge of the southern marshes, Eridu was sacred to Enki, the wise god of fresh water, and at its heart lay a temple that was rebuilt again and again across the centuries, each new shrine raised upon the ruins of the last. Layer by layer, this holy place grew into a great mound, a physical record of thousands of years of worship on a single spot. Whether or not Eridu was truly the oldest city, what matters is that its people believed it was. They looked back across the ages and imagined a beginning, a first place where the gods had gifted them the arts of settled life. In Eridu, a civilization dreamed about its own dawn. Rose beside the river as a city of the moon. Among the great cities of the south, few shone brighter than It stood near the mouth of the Euphrates, a wealthy city grown rich on trade and on the fertile fields around it. Was sacred to Nana, the god of the moon, and its people built for him one of the grandest structures of the ancient world, a mighty stepped tower whose ruins still rise from the plain today. In its golden age, ruled over a wide kingdom, and its harbors welcomed ships bearing copper, timber, and precious stones from distant lands. Deep beneath the city, archaeologists would one day uncover the tombs of its early kings and queens, filled with treasures of gold and lapis lazuli. Is remembered too as the city from which, in one ancient tradition, the patriarch Abraham set out on his long journey, a city of the moon god, of great wealth and of long memory. Stands as one of the enduring jewels of Mesopotamia. Nippur was the holy city that crowned kings. Not every great city sought power through armies and walls. Nippur, in the heart of the southern plain, held a different kind of authority, one that rested not on soldiers, but on the gods. Nippur was the sacred home of Enlil, the mighty god who was believed to hold the fates of all the land in his hands. Because of this, no king felt his rule was truly complete until he had won the blessing of Enlil at Nippur. Rulers from rival cities would compete not only on the battlefield, but for the favor of this holy place, showering its temples with gifts and grand building works. Nippur itself rarely ruled an empire, yet it made and unmade the kings who did. It was a city of priests and scribes, of libraries and learning, where much of Mesopotamia's sacred literature was written and copied and preserved. In a land of warring cities, Nippur remained a shared and neutral heart, the place where earthly power humbly bowed before the divine. Each city belonged, in theory, to its god. To the people of Mesopotamia, a city was far more than a cluster of houses and walls. It was the earthly home of a god. Each great city had its own divine patron, a deity who was believed to own the city and everything in it, and whose temple stood at the very center of daily life. Belonged to the moon god Nana, Uruk to the goddess Inanna, Babylon to the great god Marduk. The people were, in a sense, the god's servants and tenants, tending the divine household and offering food and prayers in return for protection. The temple was not tucked away at the edge of things, but stood proudly at the heart of the city, its towering form visible for miles across the flat plain. When two cities went to war, it was understood as a quarrel between their gods as much as their kings. To be a citizen was to belong, body and soul, to the great house of a deity. In Mesopotamia, the sacred and the everyday were woven tightly together. Temples were the first banks, granderies, and workshops. When we picture a temple, we imagine a quiet place of prayer. But in Mesopotamia, the temple was the beating heart of the whole economy. The god's household owned vast estates, herds of animals, and storerooms piled high with grain, and it employed a small army of workers to manage it all. Farmers brought their harvests to the temple, weavers turned its wool into cloth, and its scribes kept careful records of every transaction on tablets of clay. The temple lent out grain and silver, took in offerings, paid wages, and fed the hungry in times of famine. In many ways it worked like a bank, a warehouse, and a great workshop all at once, gathering in the wealth of the land and sending it back out again. This was one of the reasons writing was invented in the first place. simply to keep track of it all. Behind the incense and the prayers lay ledgers and accounts. The temple joined heaven and earth, and it also balanced the books. Tens of thousands of people lived where only dust remains. Today, the great cities of ancient Mesopotamia are silent mounds of earth rising from an empty plain, and it takes an active imagination to see them as they once were. But 5,000 years ago, these were among the most crowded, vibrant places on earth. Picture the noise of it, the crush of people in narrow lanes, the shouts of merchants and the braying of donkeys, the smell of baking bread and drying fish, the clatter of the potter's wheel and the ring of the coppersmith's hammer. Children played in the dust, priests climbed the temple stairs, and boats crowded the wharves along the canal. A great city like Uruk held tens of thousands of souls, each with their own hopes and worries, living and loving and laboring beneath the same wide sky. All of that life, all of that noise and warmth has long since faded into silence. Where a whole world once teemed, now only the wind moves across the ruins. It is a gentle reminder of how much a place can hold and how quietly it can pass away. Writing began not with poetry but with accounting. We might like to imagine that the first words ever written were a song, a prayer, or a line of verse, but the truth is humbler and, in its way, more human. Writing was invented to keep track of things. In the temples of Uruk, more than 5,000 years ago, the officials needed a reliable way to record how much grain came in, how many sheep were owed, how many jars of beer were handed out. Human memory could not hold it all, and so they began to press small marks into tablets of clay, a picture of a jar, a symbol for an ox, a set of strokes for a number. These first records were simple lists and receipts, the everyday paperwork of a busy temple, and yet from these dry accounts grew one of humanity's greatest gifts. Once people could write down a quantity of barley, it was only a matter of time before they could write down a name, a law, a story, a feeling. The written word began as a humble ledger and grew into the memory of the world. The first tablets counted sheep, grain, and jars of beer. The oldest writing we possess is not grand or mysterious. It is a careful accounting of ordinary things. On these earliest clay tablets, we find neat rows of marks recording deliveries of barley, counts of cattle and sheep, measures of oil, and rations of beer given out to workers. One famous early tablet simply records a quantity of grain and the name of an official responsible for it, a receipt some 5,000 years old. There is something wonderfully ordinary about this. The dawn of writing was not a thunderclap, but the quiet scratching of a clerk keeping his books in order. And yet these humble lists tell us so much. They reveal a complex society with surpluses to manage, workers to pay, and officials to hold accountable. They show a world already running on organization and record. To read these tablets is to look over the shoulder of the world's first accountants, patiently tallying the wealth of the temple, never dreaming that their dull daily work would one day be counted among the most important documents in all of history. Cuneiform was written by pressing a reed into wet clay. The writing of Mesopotamia is called cuneiform, a word that means wedge-shaped, and the name captures exactly how it looked and how it was made. A scribe would take a smooth tablet of soft, damp clay in one hand, and in the other a stylus cut from a reed, its end shaped into a neat triangular tip. By pressing this tip into the clay at different angles, the scribe left behind small wedge-shaped marks, and by combining these wedges in different patterns, hundreds of different signs could be formed. It was quick, it was practical, and it was perfectly suited to a land rich in reeds and clay. When the writing was finished, the tablet could be left to dry hard in the sun, or baked in a fire to make it nearly indestructible. There was no ink to fade, no paper to rot, just clay and reed, the humblest of materials, used to capture human thought. For 3,000 years, across many languages and empires, people would speak to one another in these little wedges pressed into the earth. A single sign could mean a word, a sound, or an idea. Cuneiform was not a simple alphabet, and learning it was no small task. In the beginning, the signs were little pictures, a drawing of a star to mean the sky or a god, a drawing of a foot to mean walking, But over time, these pictures grew simpler and more abstract, until they were just clusters of wedges that no longer looked like anything at all, and their meanings grew richer too. A single sign might stand for a whole word, or for a particular sound that could be joined with others to build new words, or for an idea that helped make sense of the signs around it. The same mark could be read in different ways depending on its place. This made cuneiform powerful and flexible, able to capture many different languages over the centuries. But it also made it wonderfully complex, a system of hundreds of signs that took years of patient study to master. Small wonder that those who could read and write were rare, respected, and quietly powerful. Scribes trained for years in a school called the Tablet House. To become a scribe was to enter one of the most respected professions in Mesopotamia, and the path was long and demanding. Boys, and just occasionally girls, were sent to a school known as the Tablet House, where they spent years learning the many hundreds of signs of cuneiform. They practiced by copying lists of words, proverbs, and passages of literature over and over onto fresh clay, smoothing the tablet and beginning again. The lessons were strict, and the schoolmasters were quick with punishment for a careless or lazy pupil. We know this because the students themselves left records of their days, complaining of canings and of being scolded for sloppy handwriting or arriving late. It was hard work, but the reward was great. A trained scribe could find employment in the temple, the palace, or the counting house, and could rise to positions of real influence. In a world where so few could read, the Tablet House was a doorway to power, learning, and a comfortable life. Its weary students were the ancestors of every schoolchild since. Most people could not read, and that gave scribes great power. In Mesopotamia, the ability to read and write was not something most people possessed. Cuneiform was so complex that mastering it took years of schooling, and only a small fraction of the population ever learned. This made the scribe a figure of quiet but real importance. When a farmer needed a contract drawn up, when a merchant sealed a deal, when a king wished to send a letter or record a victory, it was the scribe who held the pen and shaped the words. They kept the accounts of the temple and the palace, recorded the laws, and preserved the great stories of the past. To possess writing was to possess a kind of magic that most could only wonder at, a way of fixing thoughts in permanent form, and of speaking across great distances, and even across the centuries. Scribes were proud of their skill and jealously guarded it, and many rose to become trusted officials and advisors. In a land run on records, the one who kept the records held a subtle but genuine share of the power. The world's first named author was a woman. Long before Homer, before any poet whose name we remember, there lived a woman named Enheduanna. She was a princess, the daughter of the great king Sargon of Akkad, and she served as high priestess of the moon god at the city of more than 4,000 years ago, and she did something no one before her is known to have done. She wrote poetry and signed her name to it. Her hymns to the goddess Inanna are works of real power and beauty, filled with longing, devotion, and a striking personal voice. In them she speaks of her own troubles, her exile, and her faith, so that across 4,000 years we can still hear a single human being speaking to us. Enheduanna is the first author in all of history whose name we know, the first person to step out from behind the words and say, in effect, "These are mine, I wrote them." It is a wonderful thing that the first named writer in the world was a woman, a priestess, and a poet. They compiled some of the world's first dictionaries. As the centuries passed, the people of Mesopotamia came to speak and write more than one language, and the old tongue of the Sumerians, in which writing had first begun, gradually gave way to the language of the Babylonians and Assyrians. Yet the ancient Sumerian was still treasured as a sacred and scholarly language, much as Latin was long kept alive in later Europe. To preserve it, the scribes drew up great lists that set the Sumerian words beside their meanings in the newer tongue, sign by sign and word by word. These lists were, in effect, some of the earliest dictionaries in the world. Students copied them out to learn their craft, and scholars consulted them to read the ancient texts. Some of these word lists grew enormous, gathering together the names of animals, plants, stones, gods, professions, and much else, a whole ordered catalogue of the world set down in clay. In these patient lists, we see the scholarly spirit of Mesopotamia, forever gathering, sorting, and preserving knowledge for those who would come after. Students copied proverbs that still sound familiar today. Among the tablets that scribes copied in their schools were collections of proverbs, short sayings full of wit and wisdom. And it is here that the ancient world can feel startlingly close. Many of these sayings could have been spoken yesterday. They warn that wealth is hard to keep and easy to lose. They poke fun at lazy workers and nagging in-laws. They observe that a happy heart is worth more than riches. One dryly notes that you can have a lord, you can have a king, but the man to truly fear is the tax collector. Another sighs that the poor are the silent ones of the land. Reading them, we meet not distant strangers, but people much like ourselves, chuckling at the same follies and grumbling about the same troubles. These little sayings were passed from teacher to pupil, worn smooth by repetition, a kind of shared common sense stretching back thousands of years. In them, the humor and heart of an ancient people quietly survive. Some tablets are simply a child's wobbly practice lines. Not every clay tablet that survives is a royal decree or a sacred hymn. Some of the most touching are the humblest of all, the practice tablets of school children learning to write. On these we can see the careful, uneven marks of a young student copying out signs, sometimes with the neat model written by the teacher on one side and the child's shaky attempt on the other. We can watch a small hand slowly gaining skill or failing to, the wedges crooked and the lines uneven. Some tablets even bear the scribbles of children too young to write at all, just idle marks pressed into the soft clay. Across 4,000 years, these little tablets close the distance between us and the ancient world in an instant. A child sat here, tongue between teeth, struggling to form the letters, exactly as children do today. The greatest civilizations rest, in the end, upon such small and patient moments, a young mind bending to its lessons, one wobbly line at a time. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest great story we know. Long before the tales of Greece or the legends of Rome, the people of Mesopotamia told the story of Gilgamesh, a mighty king of Uruk who was part man and part god, written down more than 4,000 years ago and pieced together from tablets scattered across the ancient world. It is the oldest great work of literature that survives. In it, the proud and restless Gilgamesh meets a wild man named Enkidu, who becomes his dearest friend. Together they set off on grand adventures, battling monsters and defying the gods. But when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is shattered by grief and by the sudden, terrible knowledge that he too must one day die. The story is not just an exciting adventure, it is a meditation on friendship, loss, and the longing to matter in a world that does not last. Across 4,000 years, its questions are still our questions. In Gilgamesh, humanity first wrote down what it feels like to be mortal. Gilgamesh set out to find a way to never die. After the death of his beloved friend, the great king could not rest. The fear of his own end drove him out of his city and across the world in search of the one thing no one had ever found, the secret of eternal life. He journeyed to the ends of the earth, crossed the waters of death, and at last found the only man ever granted immortality, a survivor of a great flood who had been made deathless by the gods. From him, Gilgamesh learned of a plant at the bottom of the sea that could restore youth, and he dived down and seized it. But as he rested on his journey home, a serpent slipped by and stole the plant away, and with it his last hope of living forever. In the end, Gilgamesh returned to his city empty-handed, and yet not truly so. He came home to the great walls he had built, and understood at last that what endures of us is the good we leave behind. A Mesopotamian flood story was written down before the Bibles. Among the most striking passages in the Epic of Gilgamesh is the tale of a great flood, sent by the gods to wash the world clean. In the story, a wise man is warned of the coming deluge and told to build a great boat, to fill it with his family and with animals of every kind. The rains come, and the waters rise until all the world is drowned. and when the flood at last recedes, the boat comes to rest upon a mountain. To be sure the waters have gone down, the survivor sends out birds to search for dry land. Anyone who knows the story of Noah will feel a shiver of recognition, for this Mesopotamian flood was written down long before the biblical account. The two tales are surely branches of the same ancient memory, a story of water and survival passed down through the peoples of the Near East. In it we glimpse how the oldest fears and hopes of humanity travel quietly across the ages. History's oldest written complaint survives on clay. Not all the writing of Mesopotamia was grand poetry or sacred hymn. Some of it was gloriously, wonderfully ordinary. Preserved on a small clay tablet, nearly 4,000 years old, is what many call the oldest customer complaint in all of history. A merchant named Nani had ordered a delivery of copper, and when it arrived, the quality was poor and the dealing had been rude. So Nani did what frustrated customers have done ever since. He fired off an angry letter. In it he complains bitterly about the bad copper, the disrespect he was shown, and the messengers sent back and forth through enemy territory, and he demands to know just who the merchant thinks he is, to treat him this way. Across 4,000 years, his indignation is still perfectly clear. It is a strangely comforting thing to read. The people of Mesopotamia were not remote and solemn figures. They grumbled and fumed over shoddy goods and poor service, exactly as we do today. They wrote letters, contracts, and even lullabies. Once writing existed, the people of Mesopotamia found endless uses for it. They wrote letters to distant relatives and business partners, sealed contracts for the sale of land and slaves and cattle, and drew up marriage agreements and wills. They recorded loans and receipts, kept the accounts of temples and palaces, and copied out the great works of literature to preserve them. And they wrote gentler things too. Among the tablets is one of the oldest lullabies in the world, a soft song meant to hush a crying baby to sleep, coaxing the child to quiet so as not to wake the household god. There are love poems full of tenderness and longing, and recipes and remedies for illness. To read these tablets is to hear the full chorus of an ancient society, from the driest legal contract to the sweetest whispered song. In clay, they captured the whole of their lives and handed it, unknowing, down to us. The gods of Mesopotamia numbered in the thousands. The people of this land lived in a world crowded with the divine. There were not a handful of gods, but hundreds, even thousands, presiding over everything from the sky and the storm to the humble making of bricks. The greatest among them ruled the largest forces of the world. There was the sky god, remote and lofty, the storm and air god who held the fates of the land, and the wise god of the sweet waters beneath the earth. Below them ranged countless lesser deities, gods of grain and cattle, of rivers and reeds, of childbirth and of crafts. Each city had its own patron among them, and each person their own personal god who watched over them like a guardian. To live in Mesopotamia was to feel the divine in every corner of daily life, in the rising river and the ripening barley, in the fever that struck a child and the good fortune that blessed a harvest. Theirs was a world thick with unseen powers, and they walked through it always mindful of the gods. Inanna was the goddess of love and war at once. Of all the deities of Mesopotamia, few were as beloved or as powerful as Inanna, later known as Ishtar. She was the goddess of love and desire, of beauty and fertility, and yet also of war and fierce ambition, a goddess of the morning and evening star. This joining of love and battle in a single figure gave her a wild, unpredictable power, and she was worshipped with awe across the whole of the land. The poems written for her, some by the priestess Enheduanna, are among the most passionate in ancient literature. In one great myth, Inanna descends into the underworld, passing through 7 gates and surrendering at each one a piece of her power and finery, until she stands stripped bare before the Queen of the Dead. It is a haunting story of death and return, of a goddess who dared to enter the land of no return and come back again. Inanna was fierce, complex, and endlessly fascinating, a divine mirror of the passions of the human heart. The moon god measured out the months in a land where the fierce sun could bring drought and death. It was the gentle moon that many held most dear. The moon god, called Nonna in the south and later Sin, sailed each night across the sky in his shining boat, and his slow waxing and waning marked the passage of time. The people of Mesopotamia kept a calendar of the moon, and it was by watching his changing face that they knew when a month began and ended. The moon god was the patron of the great city of Ur, where his towering ziggurat rose against the sky, and he was honored as a wise and ancient deity, the father of the sun and of Inanna the morning star. There was something fitting in this reverence for the moon, for its soft and steady light was a comfort in the dark, and its faithful cycle was a promise that time would turn and turn again. In the quiet of the night, the people looked up and read the passing of their lives in his silver glow. Enlil held the fate of the land in his hands. Among the mightiest of all the gods was Enlil, lord of the air and the storm, whose home was the sacred city of Nippur. He was believed to hold the destinies of the whole land, and it was said that not even the other gods could look upon his face. When Enlil spoke, the fates were fixed, and no power in heaven or earth could turn them aside. Kings sought his blessing above all others, for without the favor of Enlil, no rain was thought secure. He could be generous, granting good harvests and victory in war, but he could also be terrible, sending storm and flood and famine when he was angered. In the great flood story, it was Enlil who grew weary of the noise of mankind and resolved to sweep them away. To the people of Mesopotamia, he embodied the vast and unaccountable power of nature itself, the force that gives and takes without explanation. They approached him with reverence and not a little fear. Enki was the clever god of fresh water and wisdom. If Enlil was the god of overwhelming power, Enki was the god of cleverness and craft, and he was dearly loved for it. He was lord of the sweet waters that lay beneath the earth and bubbled up in springs and wells, the life-giving fresh water that made the land bloom. But Enki was also the god of wisdom, of magic, and of all the clever arts of civilization. In story after story, it is Enki who helps humankind, teaching them crafts and skills, and outwitting the harsher designs of the other gods. When the great flood was sent to destroy mankind, it was Enki who slyly warned the one good man to build his boat, and so saved the human race. He was a trickster and a teacher, generous, subtle, and kind, the divine patron of the ancient city of Eridu. Of all the gods of Mesopotamia, Enki feels the most human and the most friendly, a god who took the side of people and quietly helped them along. They wrote down their story of how the world was made. Like all peoples, the Mesopotamians wondered how everything had begun, and they answered with a grand and stirring myth, set down in a long poem recited each year at their great New Year festival. In the beginning, it tells, there was only water, the mingling of the sweet river and the bitter sea, imagined as a pair of primordial beings. From them the younger gods were born, and in time a mighty conflict arose between the generations. The champion of the young gods was Marduk, the great god of Babylon, who did battle with the fearsome mother of the deep and overcame her. From her vast body he then fashioned the world itself, splitting her to form the heavens above and the earth below, setting the stars in their courses and appointing the moon to mark the months. Finally, humankind was made to serve the gods and ease their labor. It is a tale of order wrested from chaos, and in its telling the people of Babylon honored their city's god as the maker of the ordered world. A ziggurat was a mountain built for a god to descend. On the flat and treeless plain of Mesopotamia, where no hills rose to touch the sky, the people built mountains of their own. These were the ziggurats, great stepped towers of mud brick that climbed toward the heavens in receding tiers, with a temple at the very top. A ziggurat was not a place of public worship, and ordinary people did not climb it. Rather, it was imagined as a stairway between earth and heaven, a place where the god might descend to meet the priests, and where the priests might draw a little nearer to the god. Its heart was raised from countless sun-dried bricks, its surface covered in a shell of harder baked brick to shield it from the rains, rising high above the rooftops of the city, visible for miles across the plain. The ziggurat was a mountain made by human hands, a bridge between the world of people and the world of the gods. In a flat land, they built their way toward heaven. The great ziggurat of Ur still rises from the plain. Of all the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, The most famous and best preserved is the great ziggurat of the city of Ur, built more than 4,000 years ago in honor of the moon god. It was a mighty stepped platform, its lowest tier alone a vast rectangle of brick, with great staircases climbing to the terraces above. Though its upper levels have long since crumbled away, the massive base still stands today, restored in part, rising from the empty plain much as it did in ancient times. To stand before it is to feel the weight of an unimaginable age and the patient labor of the thousands who raised it, brick by brick, without a single machine. Along one of its ancient walls, archaeologists even found a place where the bricks bent slightly, a deliberate curve that made the great mass look straighter to the eye, a subtle trick of the builders. After 4,000 years of sun and wind and war, the ziggurat of Ur endures, the mightiest monument of a vanished world. The Tower of Babel may have been a Babylonian ziggurat. In the city of Babylon there once stood a ziggurat so vast and so famous that its memory may echo down to us in a story known the world over. It was dedicated to Marduk, the great god of Babylon, and it was called by a name that meant the foundation of heaven and earth. It rose in 7 mighty tiers, a staircase to the sky crowned with a shining temple, and travelers from distant lands marveled at its size. Many scholars believe that this great tower, glimpsed by wandering foreigners, became the seed of the biblical tale of the Tower of Babel, that proud structure by which men sought to reach the heavens. In time, the real tower fell into ruin, its bricks carted away for other buildings, until only a great pit remained where it had stood. Yet in legend it climbs forever, a symbol of human ambition reaching toward the divine. The mightiest Tower of Babylon has crumbled, but its shadow still falls across our stories. The underworld was imagined as a house of dust. The people of Mesopotamia did not look forward to a bright paradise after death. Their vision of the afterlife was somber and shadowed, a place they called the land of no return. Below the earth lay a great dark house where the dead dwelt, ruled by a stern queen and her court, a place where the departed drifted like shades, clothed in feathers like birds, eating dust and clay. There were no rewards for the virtuous, no punishments for the wicked, only the same grey twilight for everyone alike. This is why the fear of death weighed so heavily on a man like Gilgamesh, for the world beyond held little comfort, and yet the living did not abandon the dead. They buried them with care, left food and drink at their graves, and spoke their names so they would not be forgotten. For a soul who was neglected by the living was thought to suffer all the more. In remembering their dead, the people softened, just a little, the darkness of that house of dust. Sargon of Akkad built the world's first empire. For most of its early history, Mesopotamia was a patchwork of proud, quarrelsome city-states, each ruling its own fields and rarely bowing to any other. Then, around 4,300 years ago, a single extraordinary man changed everything. His name was Sargon, and rising from humble beginnings, he conquered city after city until he ruled them all, and then reached beyond to lands far away. For the first time in history, many peoples and cities were bound together under one king and one central rule. This was the world's first empire, and Sargon its first emperor. He built a new capital at a city called Akkad, whose site is still lost to us, and from there his power stretched across the whole of Mesopotamia and beyond. His empire would not last forever, but the idea of it endured. For centuries afterward, kings would look back on Sargon as the great model of a conqueror and dream of matching his glory. In him, the age of empires was born. By legend, Sargon began his life adrift in a basket. The story of how Sargon rose to power is wrapped in wonderful legend, and it may sound strangely familiar. According to a tale told long after his death, Sargon was born in secret to a lowly priestess who could not keep him. To save him, she laid him in a basket of reeds, sealed it with tar, and set it adrift upon the river, trusting his fate to the water. The basket floated downstream until a gardener drawing water found the child and raised him as his own. From these humble beginnings, the foundling grew to become the mightiest king the world had yet seen. Anyone who knows the tale of the baby Moses will hear its echo here. For this story of a child set adrift and saved was written down long before. Whether or not it was true, Sargon's people loved to tell it, for it showed that greatness could rise from the humblest of origins, plucked from a basket of reeds by the hand of fate. Naram-Sin dared to call himself a god. Sargon founded a mighty dynasty, and among his heirs was his grandson Naram-Sin, a conqueror nearly as great as Sargon himself. Under his rule, the empire reached its widest extent, and in his pride, Naram-Sin did something no king before him had dared. He declared himself a living god. On a magnificent carved monument that still survives, he is shown climbing a mountain at the head of his army, trampling his enemies underfoot, and upon his head he wears the horned crown that belonged, until then, only to the gods. It was a bold and dazzling claim that a mortal king was himself divine. Yet the later Mesopotamians remembered Naram-Sin with unease, and told stories in which his pride brought disaster upon his empire, as the gods sent wild invaders to punish his arrogance. In truth, his empire fell for many reasons, but the memory endured as a warning. Even the mightiest king, they felt, should not forget that he was a man. Pride, they knew, comes before a fall. After empire came a golden and orderly age at Ur. When the empire of Sargon and his heirs at last crumbled, Mesopotamia passed through troubled times before rising again to glory. Around 4,000 years ago, the ancient city of Ur became the seat of a new and brilliant kingdom, so celebrated that historians call this the third dynasty of Ur. Its kings ruled with remarkable order and care. They rebuilt the great cities and raised the mighty ziggurat of Ur. They dug canals and set up a careful system of administration, and their scribes produced a flood of records so vast that tens of thousands of their tablets survive today. It was an age of law and learning, of prosperity and peace, when the old Sumerian culture reached a final, radiant height. Yet even this golden age could not last, and in time the kingdom fell to invaders and famine, and Ur was sacked. Its people mourned its fall in sorrowful poems that still survive. But for a few shining generations, Ur had shown the ancient world what a well-ordered kingdom could be. King Shulgi boasted that he could run, write, and sing. Among the kings of that golden age at Ur, none shone brighter than Shulgi, who reigned for nearly half a century and gloried in his own accomplishments. He was no mere warrior, though he was that too. Shulgi presented himself as the ideal king, wise and learned and blessed in every art. In hymns composed in his honor, and perhaps at his own command, he boasts of his many talents. He claims to be a swift runner, and tells of once dashing between two distant cities and back again in a single day to celebrate festivals in both. He claims to be a scholar who could read and write as well as any scribe, a skill rare among kings. He boasts of his skill in song, in law, in languages, and in the hunt. It is a wonderful, immodest self-portrait, part truth and part royal flattery. Yet behind the boasting stands a real ambition, to be remembered not merely as a conqueror, but as a king of learning, order, and grace. Hammurabi turned a small town called Babylon into an empire. For much of early Mesopotamian history, Babylon was a place of no great importance, one modest town among many on the plain. Then came a king named Hammurabi, and everything changed. Rising to the throne of this minor city nearly 3,800 years ago, Hammurabi proved a patient and brilliant ruler. For many years he built up his city quietly, strengthening its walls and canals, before turning at last to war. Then, through a series of shrewd campaigns and clever alliances, he defeated his rivals one by one, until he had made himself master of the whole of Mesopotamia. Under Hammurabi, Babylon rose from obscurity to become the greatest city in the world, a place whose name would ring through history for 2,000 years. He is best remembered today for his famous code of laws, but he was also a canny statesman and a tireless administrator. From a small town on the river, Hammurabi built an empire and gave the world one of its most enduring names. The Assyrians built the most feared army of their age. Far to the north, along the upper reaches of the Tigris, rose a people who would become the terror of the ancient world. These were the Assyrians, and in time they forged the largest and most fearsome empire the Near East had yet seen. Their strength lay above all in their army, a professional and superbly organized force unlike anything before it. They mastered the arts of war, fielding iron weapons, swift chariots, and disciplined ranks of soldiers, and they became expert at storming the walls of cities with siege towers and battering rams. They were famous, too, for their harshness, deliberately spreading terror so that cities would surrender rather than face their wrath. At its height, the Assyrian Empire stretched from the mountains of the east all the way to Egypt. Yet these fierce warriors were also great builders and collectors, raising magnificent palaces and preserving the learning of the past. The Assyrians remind us that the ancient world could be a hard place, where power was won and held by the sharp edge of the sword. King Ashurbanipal gathered a great library of clay. The Assyrians are remembered for their armies, but one of their kings left a gift to the world far greater than any conquest. His name was Ashurbanipal, and unlike most rulers of his age, he could read and write, and he prized learning above gold. From his palace in the great city of Nineveh, he sent scribes across his empire with orders to seek out and copy every kind of text they could find. The myths, the hymns, the spells, the medical and astronomical knowledge of the ancient world. He gathered them all into a vast library, tens of thousands of clay tablets carefully arranged and catalogued in his palace. And then, by a strange gift of fate, when Nineveh was later sacked and burned, the fire that destroyed the palace baked those clay tablets hard, and so preserved them for the ages. It is largely from Ashurbanipal's library that we recovered the Epic of Gilgamesh and so much else. A king's love of learning and the flames that ended his city together saved the memory of a world. Nineveh was for a time the largest city in the world. As the Assyrian Empire reached its towering height, its capital of Nineveh grew into a wonder of the age, and for a time it may have been the largest city on earth. Set on the banks of the Tigris, it was ringed by mighty walls broad enough to drive a chariot along, pierced by great gates guarded by carved stone beasts. Within lay magnificent palaces adorned with sculptured reliefs, sprawling markets and temples to the gods. The kings brought water to the city through a marvel of engineering, cutting canals for many miles and even building a great stone aqueduct to carry it across a valley so that Nineveh's gardens could bloom. Its splendor was famous throughout the ancient world, and yet Nineveh's glory was brief. When the Assyrian Empire finally fell, the great city was besieged, stormed, and burned, and it sank so completely into ruin that later travelers passed its mounds without ever guessing the greatness that lay beneath. From the height of the world to a forgotten hill, Nineveh's story is a lesson in how swiftly grandeur can fade. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt Babylon into a city of blue and gold. After the fall of the fearsome Assyrians, Babylon rose once more to glory under a king whose name still rings through history, Nebuchadnezzar. For more than 40 years, he ruled a wide and wealthy empire, and he poured its riches into making his capital the most magnificent city on earth. He rebuilt its temples and its towering ziggurat, raised great palaces, and encircled the whole vast city with mighty walls. Through the heart of Babylon ran a grand processional way, paved with stone and lined with glittering walls of glazed brick, along which the statues of the gods were carried in splendid festival. Travelers who saw it were struck dumb with wonder, and for centuries Babylon was a byword for luxury, learning, and might. Under Nebuchadnezzar, the city reached the very summit of its glory, a place of blue glazed gates and golden shrines shining beneath the sun. It was the greatest city of its age, the beating heart of the ancient world, and its splendor would be remembered long after its walls had fallen into dust. The Ishtar Gate shone with glazed brick and golden beasts. Of all the marvels of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, none was more beautiful than the Great Northern Gate, dedicated to the goddess Ishtar. It was a towering entrance faced entirely in glazed brick of a deep and glowing blue, the rich color of lapis lazuli. And across this brilliant field marched rows of animals molded in relief, bulls and dragons picked out in gold and white. Through this dazzling gate passed the sacred processions, and any visitor entering the city would first behold this shining wall of blue and its parade of golden beasts. It must have seemed a vision from another world, Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered its shattered bricks and carefully pieced a portion of it back together, and its glowing blue surface still astonishes all who see it. The Ishtar Gate stands as a reminder that the ancient Mesopotamians were not only warriors and record keepers, but artists of extraordinary vision who could turn humble mud brick into something that glittered like a jewel. The Hanging Gardens were said to bloom in a rainless land. Among the fabled wonders of the ancient world was a marvel said to stand in Babylon, a great terraced garden rising in green tiers above the dusty plain. According to the ancient writers, it was built by a king to comfort his queen, who pined for the wooded mountains of her distant homeland. And so, they said, he raised for her a mountain of gardens, planted with trees and flowers upon high stone terraces, watered by an ingenious system that lifted river water to the very top, so that greenery cascaded down its sides like a hillside come to the city. In a hot and rainless land, such a garden would have seemed a miracle. A green paradise blooming against all nature. Curiously, no Babylonian record of these gardens has ever been found, and scholars still debate whether they truly stood in Babylon or elsewhere, or perhaps only in the imagination of later writers. But whether stone or story, the Hanging Gardens endure as a lovely dream, a vision of life and beauty conjured in the midst of the dust. Kings hunted lions to prove they could protect their people. In the ancient Near East, the lion was the very symbol of danger and wild power, and the hunting of lions became a solemn ritual of kingship. To face and slay a lion was to show that the king was strong enough to protect his people from every threat, a champion standing between his realm and the chaos of the wild. The Assyrian kings in particular gloried in the lion hunt, and they had its scenes carved in magnificent detail upon the walls of their palaces. In these reliefs, which survive to this day, we see the king drawing his bow from a speeding chariot, and the lions leaping and falling, rendered with astonishing power, and at times with unexpected tenderness. One famous carving of a wounded lioness, dragging her hind legs yet still roaring in defiance, is among the most moving works of art from the whole ancient world. In the lion hunt, the Mesopotamians joined together kingship, courage, and a strange and lasting beauty. Hammurabi carved his laws in stone for all to see. The great king Hammurabi of Babylon is remembered above all for one remarkable achievement, a code of laws that he had carved upon a tall pillar of black stone and set up in public for all to behold. Nearly 300 laws are inscribed upon it, covering the whole of life, from theft and trade to marriage and injury, each written as a clear case. If a man does this, then this shall be his penalty. At the top of the great stone is carved a scene of the king standing before the God of justice, receiving from him the authority to rule and to judge. By setting his laws in stone in a public place, Hammurabi declared that justice was not the secret whim of officials, but a known and settled thing, the same for all who could come and read it or have it read to them. The great pillar survives to this day, one of the treasures of the ancient world. In it, a king nearly 4,000 years dead still lays out his vision of a just and ordered realm. An eye for an eye is older than you think. Among the laws of Hammurabi is a principle that has echoed down the ages, the idea that a punishment should match the crime, an eye for an eye and a bone for a bone. If a man destroyed the eye of another, his own eye was to be destroyed in turn. To our ears it can sound harsh, but in its own day, this was in part an attempt at fairness and restraint, a way of ensuring the punishment did not wildly exceed the offense, and that justice was not left to private revenge and endless feud. The same principle would appear centuries later in the laws of other peoples, including those recorded in the Bible. It is striking to find so familiar a phrase reaching back so very far, first pressed into stone on the plains of Babylon. Behind it lies an old and human longing, the wish that wrongs should be answered in fair measure, and that the scales of justice should balance, neither too light nor too heavy. The law treated a noble and a servant very differently. For all its concern with justice, the law of Hammurabi was not equal in the way we would hope for today. It divided people into ranks, the noble, the commoner, and the slave, and it treated the same crime very differently depending on who suffered it and who committed it. To injure a nobleman brought a heavy penalty, but to injure a commoner or a slave brought a much lighter one, often only a payment of silver. The famous principle of an eye for an eye applied fully only among equals of the higher class. This was a world that took for granted that people were born into different stations, with different worth in the eyes of the law. It is a useful reminder that the ancient past was not a mirror of our own values, and that ideas we hold dear, such as the equality of all before the law, were unknown to them. And yet the very attempt to write the law down, and to bind even the powerful to it, was itself a step upon a very long road. There were written laws centuries before Hammurabi. Famous as it is, the Code of Hammurabi was not the first collection of laws in Mesopotamia, only the best preserved and most celebrated. Long before him, other kings had set down laws for their people. The oldest that survives was issued by a king of Ur some 3 centuries earlier, and its tone is in some ways gentler than Hammurabi's, favoring fines and payments over harsh bodily punishment. There were others too, from various cities, each an attempt to bring order and fairness to the tangled affairs of people living close together. What all of them share is the remarkable idea that the rules of a society should be written down, made public, and applied to all, rather than resting on the shifting moods of whoever happened to hold power. This is one of Mesopotamia's quiet and lasting gifts. Long before the famous lawgivers of Greece and Rome, the peoples of the 2 rivers had already grasped that a just society must rest upon written and knowable law. Contracts were sealed with the roll of a carved cylinder. In a bustling world of trade and property, the people of Mesopotamia needed a way to mark a document as genuine, to sign a contract or seal a jar as truly their own. Their clever solution was the cylinder seal, a small cylinder of stone carved on its surface with a design cut in reverse. When this little cylinder was rolled across a strip of wet clay, it left behind a raised picture, a tiny frieze that could stretch as long as the clay allowed. Each seal was unique to its owner, carved with gods, animals, heroes, or scenes of worship, so that its rolled impression served as a personal signature that could not easily be forged. Merchants, officials, and ordinary citizens carried their seals with them, often worn on a cord around the neck or wrist. With a simple roll of stone on clay, a deal was sealed and a name was set. It was a signature, a stamp, and a small work of art, all turning together in the hand. A cylinder seal was a person's signature and their pride. Beyond their everyday use, the little cylinder seals of Mesopotamia became treasured personal possessions, and among the finest works of art the civilization produced, carved into hard stones such as agate, lapis lazuli, and carnelian. They are astonishingly detailed for their tiny size, their surfaces alive with gods and worshippers, bulls and lions, heroes and mythic scenes. To cut such a design in reverse into hard stone, and at so small a scale, took the skill of a true master, and a fine seal was a mark of its owner's wealth and standing. People valued them dearly, kept them close, and were sometimes buried with them. For us, these seals are a wonderful window into the ancient imagination, for their rolled impressions preserve countless scenes of myth and daily life that we would otherwise never see. Small enough to hold in a closed hand, a cylinder seal carried a person's name, their taste and their pride, pressed in miniature into the enduring clay. We still count time the Mesopotamian way, in 60s. Whenever you glance at a clock, you are using a system born on the plains of Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. The scholars of Babylon counted not in tens, as we usually do, but in 60s, a system we call sexagesimal. 60 is a wonderfully convenient number, for it can be divided evenly in a great many ways, by 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, which made it marvelously useful for trade, for measuring, and for mathematics. This ancient love of 60 has never left us. It is why an hour holds 60 minutes, and a minute 60 seconds, and why we still reckon the passing moments of our lives in these ancient units. Every time we say half past, or count down the final seconds of the year, we are speaking, without knowing it, the mathematical language of Babylon. Of all the gifts this civilization left to the world, few are so intimate and so constant as this. The very shape of our hours was decided long ago, beside the two rivers. 60 minutes and 360 degrees are their gift. The Mesopotamian love of the number 60 reaches even further than the clock. When we divide a circle into 360 degrees, we are following their ancient reckoning. For 360 is 6 times 60, and it fitted neatly with their counting, and with the roughly 360 days they saw in a year. From this comes the way we measure angles, and the way sailors and astronomers map the heavens and the earth. The full turn of a circle, the slice of an angle, the coordinates of a place upon the globe, all of these still carry the fingerprint of Babylon. It is a marvelous thought that a decision made by ancient stargazers, watching the slow wheel of the sky, should still govern the mathematics of our modern world. When an engineer speaks of a 90-degree angle, or a pilot banks into a turn, the old wisdom of Mesopotamia is quietly at work. Their number 60, chosen so long ago, still measures out the circles of our lives. They solved problems we would now call algebra. The mathematicians of Mesopotamia were far more than simple counters of sheep and grain. On tablet after tablet, we find them working through problems of real sophistication, the kinds of puzzles we would today set down as algebra. They could find unknown quantities, solve problems involving areas and volumes, and handle what we would call quadratic equations, all without any of the symbols and notation we now use, working instead through words and worked examples. They compiled tables to help with multiplication, division, and the finding of roots, tools that let them tackle complex calculations with speed. Much of this was practical, needed for surveying fields, digging canals, sharing out inheritances, and reckoning taxes and trade. But some of it seems to have been done for the sheer love of the puzzle. To read these tablets is to realize that the ancient world held minds every bit as sharp as our own, delighting 4,000 years ago in the same abstract play of numbers that fascinates mathematicians still. One clay tablet holds numbers like a Pythagorean puzzle. Among the most famous of all Mesopotamian mathematical tablets is a small broken piece of clay covered in columns of numbers, written more than 3,700 years ago. At first glance, it seems a dry list, but scholars realized it holds something remarkable. Its rows contain sets of numbers that fit the rule we now name after the Greek Pythagoras, the relationship between the sides of a right triangle. Yet this tablet was written more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. It shows that the mathematicians of Babylon understood this deep relationship of numbers long before the Greeks set it down as a theorem. Just what the tablet was for is still debated, whether a teacher's aid, a table of triangles, or a piece of pure mathematical exploration. But its meaning is clear enough. The knowledge we credit to later ages was often glimpsed and sometimes fully grasped by the patient scholars of Mesopotamia, working quietly in clay long before. They drew the oldest known map of the world on clay. Among the treasures of Mesopotamia is a small clay tablet that holds something truly remarkable, the oldest known attempt to map the whole of the world. Upon it is scratched a simple diagram, a circle representing the great ocean that was thought to ring the earth, and within it the land, with the city of Babylon and the winding line of the Euphrates set near the center. Beyond the encircling sea, triangles mark far off and mysterious regions at the edge of the known world. It is not a map as we would draw one, for it mixes geography with belief, placing Babylon proudly at the heart of everything, but it shows a mind reaching out to grasp the whole shape of the world and set it down in a single picture. To gaze upon it is to share, across thousands of years, in that very human wish to know where we stand and what lies beyond the horizon. In this little clay circle, an ancient people drew the boundaries of their world. They mapped the sky and tracked the wandering planets. Night after night, under the wide, clear skies of the plain, the scholars of Mesopotamia watched the heavens with tireless patience, and they became the first great astronomers of the world. They charted the fixed stars and grouped them into constellations, many of which we still recognize today. They followed with special care the wandering lights we call the planets, tracking their strange journeys back and forth against the background of stars, and recording their movements over years and generations. They noted the risings and settings of the moon, and the changing shape of its face, and the slow shift of the sun through the seasons. All of this they wrote down in careful records, building up over the centuries an astonishing body of observation. They watched not out of idle curiosity alone, but because they believed the movements of the heavens held messages from the gods. Yet in their patient watching, they laid the true foundations of astronomy and taught the world to read the story written in the stars. The zodiac was born on the plains of Babylon. When we speak of the signs of the zodiac, the ram, the bull, the twins and the rest, we are echoing the sky watchers of ancient Babylon. It was they who divided the band of sky through which the sun and moon and planets appear to travel into 12 equal portions, and gave each portion its sign. These 12 divisions, tied to constellations, became a tool for tracking the movements of the heavens and marking the turning of the year. From Babylon, this system passed to the Greeks, and from them to the wider world, and it endures to this day in the star signs that many still read in the newspaper. The Babylonians watched the sky above all to seek omens and to divine the will of the gods. And from this ancient practice grew both astronomy, the careful science of the stars, and astrology, the reading of fate within them. The circle of the zodiac, still familiar after thousands of years, was first drawn against the night by the patient watchers of the two rivers. Babylonian stargazers learnt to predict eclipses. The astronomers of Babylon watched the sky so closely and for so many generations that they began to uncover its hidden rhythms. Among their greatest achievements was learning to foresee eclipses, those sudden and frightening moments when the sun is darkened by day or the moon swallowed by shadow at night. By keeping careful records over centuries, they discovered that eclipses repeat in a long and regular cycle, and once they knew the pattern, they could predict when the next was likely to fall. This was a matter of the gravest importance, for an eclipse was thought to be a dire omen, especially for the king. So seriously was this taken that a substitute king might be placed upon the throne to absorb the danger, while the true king waited safely aside until the peril had passed. From fear and reverence grew real and precise science. The stargazers of Babylon, watching for the shadow to fall, learnt to read the clockwork of the heavens with a skill that still commands our admiration. They kept the longest record of the sky in history. Perhaps the most astonishing achievement of the Babylonian astronomers was not any single discovery, but their sheer, patient persistence. Night after night, year after year, generation after generation, they recorded what they saw in the heavens, the positions of the moon and planets, the appearance of eclipses, the weather, and much else, on tablet after tablet of clay. These records, which scholars call the astronomical diaries, were kept up for many centuries, forming what may be the longest continuous record of scientific observation in all of human history. No single lifetime could gather such knowledge, and so it was passed down, added to steadily by scribe after scribe across the ages. This vast archive allowed them to detect the slow cycles of the sky that only reveal themselves over the span of many decades. It is a humbling example of what patience can achieve when knowledge is treasured and handed on faithfully from one generation to the next. The stars were watched and written down for longer than most civilizations have even lasted. Their calendar of the moon needed an extra month. The people of Mesopotamia measured their months by the moon, beginning each new month with the first thin sliver of the crescent in the evening sky. It was a beautiful and natural way to mark time, but it carried a problem. 12 moons fall a little short of a full solar year, so a calendar of the moon slowly slips out of step with the seasons until festivals meant for spring drift back toward winter. The Mesopotamians solved this with a clever remedy. Every few years, they simply added an extra month to the calendar, a leap month, to nudge the moon and the sun back into agreement. At first, this was done whenever the priests judged it needful, but in time they worked out a regular cycle for it, so that the extra months fell in a fixed and predictable pattern. It was an elegant fix to an ancient puzzle, keeping the harvest festivals in their proper season, year after year. In their careful stitching together of the moon and the sun, we see again their patient genius for bringing order to the heavens. doctors diagnosed by symptom and treated with herbs. The healers of Mesopotamia had gathered, over long centuries, a considerable store of practical medical knowledge. On tablets that survive, we find careful lists of symptoms and the treatments to match them. An early kind of medical handbook. A physician would examine the sick person, note the signs of the illness, its fevers and swellings and pains, and then prescribe a remedy. Many of their treatments drew on the plants and minerals around them, herbs and roots and resins mixed into salves, drinks and poultices. Some of these remedies, tested by long experience, may well have brought real relief. The healers also kept records of which illnesses tended to worsen and which to mend, building a rough sense of how diseases ran their course. It was not medicine as we know it, for they did not understand the true causes of sickness. Yet in their patient observing of symptoms and their careful matching of remedy to ailment, we can see the distant beginnings of the healing art, tended with real care beside the two rivers. Some healing was medicine, and some was whispered spell. In Mesopotamia, sickness was understood in two ways at once, and so it was met with two kinds of healer. Sometimes an illness was thought to have a natural cause, and then the physician came with his herbs and salves and practical remedies. But often sickness was blamed on angry gods, on ghosts, or on the work of demons and curses. And then a different sort of healer was called, one who worked with prayers, spells, and rituals to drive the evil spirit away. The two kinds of healer worked side by side, and often together, one treating the body, and the other the unseen forces thought to trouble it. A patient might be given a herbal draught and an incantation in the same breath. To us, these worlds seem far apart, the medicine and the magic. But to them, they were simply two faces of the same effort, the attempt to restore a suffering person to health. In their remedies and their whispered spells alike, we hear an ancient and tender wish that the sick be made well. They modeled a sheep's liver in clay to read the future. Among the many ways the Mesopotamians sought to know the will of the gods, one of the most important was the reading of the liver of a sacrificed animal, usually a sheep. The priests believed that the gods wrote their intentions into the flesh of the beast, and that a trained diviner could read the future in the shape and markings of its liver. So seriously was this taken that they made careful models of the liver in clay, marked out into regions and covered with notes, to serve as guides and teaching tools for the diviners. Several of these curious clay livers survive today, like maps of an unseen country. Before a king went to war, before any great decision was made, the diviners might be called to search the entrails for a sign. It seems strange to us now, yet it sprang from a deep and earnest desire, the wish to lift the veil of the future and to act in harmony with the powers that ruled the world. In a sheep's liver, they sought a message from the gods. The reading of omens guided every great decision. The people of Mesopotamia lived in a world alive with signs, and they believed that the gods were forever sending messages to those who knew how to read them. An omen might be found in almost anything, in the movement of the stars, the flight of birds, the shape of a newborn animal, the pattern of oil poured upon water, or a dream in the night. Scribes compiled vast collections of omens, listing endless signs and the events they were thought to foretell, so that the diviners could look up their meaning. Before undertaking anything of importance, a king would seek out the omens, and if they were unfavorable, even a planned battle or building might be delayed. This constant watching for signs shaped the whole of their thinking and drove much of their careful observation of the natural world. From the wish to read the gods' warnings grew a habit of patient recording that fed their science. In seeking the future in every quarter of the world, they learned, almost by accident, to look very closely indeed. The potter's wheel may have led to the wheel itself. We think of the wheel as one of the great inventions of humankind, and it was in Mesopotamia that it seems first to have turned. Curiously, its earliest use may not have been for travel at all, but for making pots. The potter's wheel, a turning disc upon which wet clay could be shaped with wonderful speed and evenness, appeared in Mesopotamia long ago, and it transformed the making of vessels. From the spinning of the potter's wheel, it may have been a natural step to imagine a wheel set upright and turning upon an axle to carry loads. Whether the two inventions were truly linked, we cannot be certain, but both arose in this same fertile land of makers and thinkers. The humble wheel, whether bearing clay or cargo, would go on to change the world in ways its inventors could never have dreamed. And it began here, in the workshops and roadways of Mesopotamia, as a simple disc of wood or clay, patiently turning. Wheeled carts changed how much one ox could carry. Once the wheel was set beneath a cart, the labor of the world was lightened. Before the wheel, goods had to be carried on the backs of people or animals, or dragged upon sledges, and there were limits to what could be moved. But a cart on wheels, drawn by an ox or a team of donkeys, could haul far heavier loads over far greater distances with far less effort. Grain could be brought in from distant fields, stone and reed carried to the building sites, and the goods of trade rolled from town to town. The earliest wheels were solid discs of wood, heavy and slow, but they were a marvel all the same. In time, these gave way to lighter wheels, and eventually, with the coming of spokes, to the swift war chariot that would thunder across the battlefields of the ancient world. From the plodding ox cart to the racing chariot, it all began with that first simple idea, to set a load upon a wheel and let it roll. The cedar plow sowed grain as it cut the furrow. The farmers of Mesopotamia were clever inventors, and one of their finest tools was a plow that did two jobs at once. To the ordinary plow, which cut a furrow in the soil, they added a funnel and a tube, so that as the ox drew the plow forward and the blade opened the earth, seed could be poured down the funnel and dropped neatly into the furrow at just the right depth. In a single pass, the field was both opened and sown. This was a great saving of labor, and it helped ensure that the precious seed was planted evenly and well, rather than scattered wastefully by hand. Scenes of such plows appear in their art, and instructions for farming survive that speak of their careful use. It is a lovely example of Mesopotamian ingenuity, of people looking at a hard task and finding a way to do it better. In the rich soil between the rivers, even the humble work of sowing was met with invention. They built true arches long before Rome. We often credit the Romans with the arch, that graceful curve of stone or brick that can carry great weight across an open space. But the builders of Mesopotamia were raising arches thousands of years before Rome was even founded. Working in a land without much stone, they became masters of the humble mud brick, and they learned to lay their bricks in curving spans to form arches and vaults. With these, they roofed their gateways, their drains, and their tombs, spanning openings that a simple flat beam could never have crossed, especially in a land so short of timber. The great gates of their cities rose in mighty arches, and beneath their streets ran vaulted drains built of brick. It was a sophisticated art, demanding a real understanding of how weight and thrust are carried through a curve. Long before the famous arches of Rome, the builders of the two rivers had already grasped this elegant secret and shaped their world of brick with its quiet strength. The sailboat let the rivers carry trade both ways. The two great rivers were the highways of Mesopotamia, but they flowed only one way, down toward the sea. To carry goods downstream was easy enough, drifting with the current on rafts and reed boats, but to bring them back up against the flow was hard labor. The answer was the sail. By raising a sail to catch the wind, which often blew inland from the sea, boats could be pushed upriver against the current, so that trade could flow in both directions. The sailboat is another of Mesopotamia's early gifts, and it opened up the rivers as never before. Laden vessels could now carry grain, wool, stone, timber, and all the goods of trade up and down the length of the land, and out along the coast to distant shores. With sail and current and the strong arms of oarsmen, the rivers became busy roads of water. In harnessing the wind, the people of the two rivers set their world in motion and drew far-off lands within their reach. They made glass and glazed their bricks with color. The craftsmen of Mesopotamia discovered how to make glass, that strange and beautiful substance born of sand and fire, and they used their skill to bring color into their world. They fashioned small glass beads and vessels, prized for their gleam, and they learned to coat bricks and tiles with a glassy glaze, fired to a brilliant and lasting color. It was this art that gave the great Ishtar Gate of Babylon its glowing blue, and adorned the walls of palaces with beasts and flowers picked out in bright, enduring hues. In a land whose natural building material was the plain brown of mud brick, this power to add color must have seemed close to magic, turning drab walls into surfaces that shone like jewels. The recipes for making glass and glaze were carefully guarded, written down in cuneiform as precious secrets of the craft. Through their mastery of sand and fire, the Mesopotamians clothed their cities in color and left the world some of its earliest and loveliest works of glass. They brewed beer and counted it among life's blessings. Few things were dearer to the people of Mesopotamia than their beer. Brewed from barley bread and flavored in many ways, it was drunk by everyone, from the humblest laborer to the king, and it was as much a food as a drink, thick and nourishing, often sipped through a straw to avoid the grains and husks that floated on top. Beer was so important that it was handed out as wages, offered to the gods, and celebrated in poetry. There even survives a hymn to the goddess of brewing, which praises the making of beer in loving detail and reads, in part, like the world's oldest recipe. To share a jar of beer was a sign of friendship and good fellowship, and the tavern was a lively corner of daily life. In their love of this simple golden drink, the ancient Mesopotamians feel wonderfully close to us. After the long labor of the fields, they too liked nothing better than to sit together and share a cup and count it among the good things of life. Bread and beer came from the same golden barley. At the heart of the Mesopotamian table stood two things above all others, bread and beer, and both were born of the same humble grain. Barley was ground into flour and baked into bread, the daily food of everyone in the land, and barley was also the source of their beloved beer. For the two were made by closely related arts, so much so that beer was sometimes thought of as a kind of liquid bread. Together, bread and beer formed the foundation of the diet, a pairing so basic that to have them both was to have the essentials of life. Workers were often paid in exactly these two things, a measure of grain and a measure of beer, enough to keep body and spirit going. There is something pleasing in the thought that the whole towering civilization of Mesopotamia, its temples and its kings, its writing and its stars, rested in the end upon a field of golden barley, turned by patient hands into the bread and the beer of ordinary days. Lapis lazuli traveled 1,000 miles to reach a king's tomb. Among the most treasured of all materials in Mesopotamia was lapis lazuli, a stone of the deepest, richest blue, flecked with tiny points of gold. The people prized it above almost all else, using it for beads, jewelry, and the finest ornaments, and seeing in its heavenly blue something of the divine. But lapis lazuli was found in only one distant corner of the world, in the far mountains of what is now Afghanistan, more than 1,000 miles away. To reach the tombs and treasuries of Mesopotamia, it had to pass along a great chain of trade, from hand to hand and land to land, across mountains and deserts and rivers, that so much of it made this immense journey speaks of how deeply it was desired, and of how far the threads of trade already reached in the ancient world. When we find lapis lazuli glowing in a Mesopotamian tomb, we are looking at the end of a journey of 1,000 miles, a piece of far-off mountains carried lovingly to the plain between the rivers, a land without stone or metal traded for everything. The southern plain of Mesopotamia was blessed with rich soil and abundant water, but it was strangely poor in many other things. It had almost no stone for building, no metal ores, no precious gems, and little good timber. Everything of that kind had to come from elsewhere, and so the people became great traders, exchanging what they had in plenty, above all their grain and their fine woven cloth, for the things they lacked. From the mountains came stone, timber, and metals, copper and tin and silver and gold. From distant lands came precious stones and rare goods of every kind. Long trading journeys, by river, by donkey caravan, and by ship along the coast, knit Mesopotamia into a web of exchange that stretched for thousands of miles. In this way, a land with little but mud and grain drew to itself the riches of half the world. Their wealth was built not only on their fields, but on their skill as merchants, turning barley and cloth into the treasures of far-off lands. Silver by weight served as money before coins existed. Long before the first coins were ever struck, the people of Mesopotamia had a form of money, and it was silver. But their silver did not come in neat, stamped coins. Instead, it was used by weight, in lumps, rings, and coils of the metal, measured out on a balance against standard weights whenever a payment was made. A price might be set as so many measures of silver, and the buyer would weigh out the proper amount. Grain, too, served as a kind of money for everyday dealings, but silver was the great standard of value for larger sums, a convenient and lasting measure of wealth. This clever system let them reckon prices, wages, debts, and taxes across their whole complex economy, all without a single coin. The idea of coinage, of money stamped into fixed and trusted pieces, would come only much later, from elsewhere. But the deeper idea of a standard measure of value that could be traded for anything was already alive and well beside the two rivers, weighed out patiently in silver. The standard of shows a city at war and at peace. Among the treasures recovered from the ancient tombs of is a small and beautiful object that scholars call the Standard of a wooden box inlaid with tiny pieces of shell, red stone, and glowing lapis lazuli, made more than 4,500 years ago. Its two long sides tell two stories. On one, we see scenes of war, ranks of soldiers and rumbling chariots, the king triumphant over his defeated foes. On the other, we see scenes of peace and plenty, people bringing animals and goods, and a joyful feast with a musician playing before the seated king. Together, the two sides show the whole life of an ancient city, its battles and its banquets, its violence and its abundance. Though we are not certain what the object was truly for, it remains one of the most vivid windows we have into the world of early Mesopotamia, in its little inlaid figures, patiently set in shell and stone. A vanished city still marches, feasts and celebrates, more than 4,000 years on. In Queen Puabi's tomb lay a golden headdress. When archaeologists dug into the ancient graves of they made discoveries of breathtaking richness, and none more so than the tomb of a lady named Puabi, a queen or high priestess who died some 4,500 years ago. She was buried in extraordinary splendor, adorned from head to foot in gold and precious stones. Upon her head lay an elaborate headdress of golden leaves, rings, and flowers, set with lapis lazuli and carnelian, and about her were rich ornaments, a golden cup, and countless beads. Yet the tombs of held a darker wonder too, for around the great ones were laid the bodies of many attendants, servants and guards and musicians, who seem to have gone with their masters into death. It is a haunting glimpse of a world both dazzling and strange. In the gleam of Puabi's golden headdress, we see the wealth and artistry of early and in the silent rows around her, we sense beliefs about death and duty that we can now only wonder at. The royal game of was played for thousands of years. People in the ancient world loved to play, and among the treasures of was found a beautiful game board, inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli, for a game we now call the royal game of It was a racing game for two players, in which pieces were moved along a course according to the throw of dice, each striving to bring their pieces home before the other. Remarkably, a cuneiform tablet survives that even lays out the rules, so that after thousands of years we can play it once again much as the ancients did. And play it they did, all across the Near East, for this game was enjoyed for a very long time, in one form or another, over thousands of years. Boards for it have been found scratched into the stones of palaces, where bored guards must have whiled away their hours. There is something delightful in the thought of people 4,000 years ago, hunched over a board, laughing and groaning at the roll of the dice, exactly as we do today. Golden lyres were played at royal feasts. From the same royal tombs of came some of the oldest stringed instruments ever found. Beautiful lyres adorned with gold and lapis lazuli, several crowned with the magnificent head of a bull worked in gold and precious stone. These were no simple toys, but the finest of instruments, played to delight kings and to honor the gods at feasts and ceremonies. Though the wooden frames had long crumbled in the earth, enough survived for their glory to be reconstructed, and they are among the most beautiful objects to come down to us from the ancient world. In their day, their soft notes would have drifted through the halls of accompanying song and celebration. To imagine the sound is to bring the ancient city briefly back to life. The gleam of gold in lamplight, the murmur of guests, and the gentle voice of the strings. In these golden lyres, we are reminded that the people of Mesopotamia loved beauty and celebration, and filled their finest moments with the pleasure of song. The world's first named chemist made perfume. On a clay tablet more than 3,000 years old, there is recorded the name of a woman named Taputi, who oversaw the making of perfumes at a royal palace. And because of this, she is often called the first chemist in all of history whose name we know. Making fine perfume was no simple matter. It called for real skill and method, steeping fragrant flowers, herbs, and resins, mixing them with oils and water, and gently heating and filtering the mixture again and again to draw out and capture the precious scent. The tablet even records something of her methods, an early glimpse of chemistry at work. That the first named practitioner of this careful art was a woman is a lovely thing, echoing the priestess Enheduanna, the first named author. In the sweet-smelling workshops of the palace, Taputi blended her fragrances with patience and care, and quietly earned her place, thousands of years later, at the very beginning of the long story of chemistry. Women could own property, trade, and run taverns. The world of Mesopotamia was ruled largely by men, yet women were far from powerless, and they took an active part in the life of the land. Women could own property in their own name, buy and sell, lend and borrow, and go to court to defend their rights. Some ran their own businesses. It was often women who brewed and sold beer, and the keeper of a tavern was frequently a woman. In the temples, priestesses held positions of great honor and influence, chief among them the poet Enheduanna, who was the daughter of a king. Women worked as weavers, as scribes, as healers, and as traders, and marriage contracts sometimes protected a wife's interests with real care. Their world set many limits upon them, as most ancient worlds did, and they did not stand equal to men. Yet within those limits, the women of Mesopotamia lived busy and capable lives, weaving, brewing, trading, worshipping, and now and then, as with Enheduanna, leaving their names to echo across 4,000 years. Most people lived in snug houses of mud brick, away from the grand temples and palaces. The ordinary people of Mesopotamia lived in modest homes built of the most abundant material at hand, mud brick. Bricks were shaped from river mud mixed with straw and dried hard in the sun, then laid up into thick walls that kept the fierce heat out by day and held warmth through the cool of night. A typical house was built around a small central courtyard, open to the sky, with rooms arranged about it for sleeping, cooking, and storage. The rooftop, flat and sturdy, became another living space, where families might sleep on hot summer nights beneath the stars. The streets between the houses were narrow and winding, alive with the bustle of daily life. These humble homes of earth have long since melted back into the ground, and yet in their day they were snug and practical dwellings, well suited to the climate, and made entirely from the land itself. In their simple courtyards, the everyday life of Mesopotamia was quietly lived. The date palm gave food, shade, and sweetness. If barley was the grain of Mesopotamia, the date palm was its beloved tree, and it was cherished almost beyond any other plant. It thrived in the hot, wet soil of the south where few other trees could grow, and it gave, with wonderful generosity, a whole range of gifts. Its sweet dates were a staple food, eaten fresh or dried, and pressed to make a thick, honey-like syrup that sweetened a land that had no sugar. Its fronds gave material for baskets, mats, and roofing. Its trunk gave timber in a land poor in wood, and its broad crown gave precious shade from the burning sun. So useful was the date palm that it appears again and again in their art and their writing, and there even survive lists praising its many uses to the people of the two rivers. The date palm was a faithful friend, standing tall in the heat and offering food, shelter, and sweetness. In its generous shade, they found comfort against the harshness of their sun-baked land. Babylon fell to Cyrus of Persia almost without a fight. For all its glory, the great age of Babylon at last came to an end, and its ending was strangely quiet. In the days of its final king, a new power had risen in the east, the mighty Persian Empire led by Cyrus the Great. When Cyrus turned his armies toward Babylon, the ancient city, weakened by discontent within, did not put up the fierce resistance one might expect. The Persians entered Babylon, by the ancient accounts, with little bloodshed, and the long independence of the city came to a close. Cyrus presented himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator, respecting the city's gods and customs, and Babylon lived on as a great city within the Persian Empire. But it would never again be the seat of its own kings. The fall of Babylon marked the passing of an age, as the ancient civilization of the two rivers, which had given the world so much, slipped quietly under the rule of others. A world that had lasted 3,000 years was gently drawing toward its close. Cyrus let the captive peoples return to their homes. When Cyrus of Persia took Babylon, he did something that won him lasting fame for mercy. Rather than crushing the peoples who lived under Babylon's rule, he allowed many of them to return to their homelands and to worship their own gods as they pleased. Among those said to have benefited were the people of Judah, who had been carried into exile in Babylon and were now permitted to go home and rebuild their temple. Cyrus set down his policy of tolerance on a clay cylinder inscribed in cuneiform, which survives to this day and is sometimes called one of the earliest statements of its kind. Whatever his true motives, this gentler way of ruling helped bind his vast empire together, and it left a memory of the Persian king as a wise and generous lord. In this act, we see the old world of Mesopotamia passing its story on, for even as its own power faded, the deeds done in its ancient cities would be remembered for thousands of years. The old cities slowly emptied as the world moved on. After the coming of the Persians, and later the Greeks under Alexander, the ancient cities of Mesopotamia entered a long, slow twilight. New rulers built new capitals, and the centers of power and trade gradually shifted elsewhere. The old ways lingered for a time. Priests still tended the temples, and scribes still wrote in cuneiform, keeping up their astronomical records even as the world changed around them. But little by little, the ancient cities lost their people. Canals silted up, temples fell into disrepair, and the great urban centers that had thrived for thousands of years began to shrink and empty. It was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gentle fading, as one age gave way to another. The knowledge and inventions of Mesopotamia did not vanish, but passed on into the wider world, carried in the minds of those who had learned them. Yet the cities themselves, where it had all begun, were quietly being left behind, their long day drawing at last toward evening. The last cuneiform tablet was written beneath the stars. For thousands of years, the wedge-shaped writing of Mesopotamia had recorded the life of the land, but every long story has its final page. As new alphabets spread and the old cities faded, fewer and fewer people could still read and write cuneiform, until at last only a small number of temple scholars kept the ancient skill alive. The very latest cuneiform tablets that survive are, fittingly, astronomical records, written by the last of the star-watching priests as they carried on their age-old observations of the heavens. Sometime around 2,000 years ago, the final tablet was pressed into clay, and with it a tradition of writing 3,000 years old came quietly to its end. There was no announcement, no ceremony, only an old craft slipping at last into silence. Those final tablets, gazing still at the same stars their ancestors had charted, are a poignant farewell. The oldest writing in the world signed off, as it had so often begun, with a patient record of the wheeling night sky. The old gods faded as new faiths arose. The gods of Mesopotamia had been worshipped for thousands of years, their temples the heart of every city, their festivals the rhythm of the year. But as the ancient cities emptied and new powers and new beliefs spread across the land, the worship of these old gods slowly withered away. The great temples fell silent, their offerings ceased, and the names of Marduk and Inanna and Enlil, once spoken with awe by whole cities, faded from the lips of the living. In time, new faiths came to the lands between the rivers, and the old gods were remembered, if at all, only as figures in half-forgotten stories. It is a strange and moving thing to think of gods who were once the very center of a people's world, gradually slipping into oblivion. For a time they had shaped everything: the planting of the fields, the crowning of kings, the reading of the stars, and then, gently, over centuries, they were let go, until only the silent ruins of their temples remained to remember them. The cities melted back into the mud they were made from. The great cities of Mesopotamia had been built of mud brick, drawn from the earth of the plain, and in the end it was to that same earth that they returned. Once a city was abandoned and its people gone, there was no one left to repair the walls against the rain and the wind. Slowly, season by season, the mud brick began to crumble and dissolve, the walls sagging and washing down into shapeless heaps. Rubble and dust gathered, and the desert winds heaped sand over all. Over the long centuries, the proud towers and temples, the palaces and houses, sank and softened until they became low mounds of earth, scarcely distinguishable from natural hills. The rivers themselves shifted their courses and wandered away, leaving some once great cities stranded in dry and empty land. It was a quiet and complete forgetting. The cities that had first taught the world to read and to build had melted, at last, back into the very mud from which they had first been raised. For centuries, Mesopotamia lay forgotten beneath grassy mounds. So thoroughly did the ancient cities crumble away, that for a very long time, the world quite forgot they had ever been there. Where Uruk and Ur and Nineveh had once stood, there were now only low, silent mounds rising from the plain, covered in grass and dust. Travelers passed them by, taking them for natural hills, never guessing that beneath their feet lay the ruins of the oldest cities on earth and the buried libraries of a lost civilization. The great stories of Mesopotamia, its kings and its gods and its inventions, slipped almost entirely from human memory, surviving only as dim and garbled echoes in the pages of the Bible and a few ancient authors. For close to 2,000 years, one of the most important chapters in the whole story of humankind lay hidden and unread beneath the earth. The birthplace of writing had itself become unreadable, a land of anonymous hills, waiting in patient silence for someone, at last, to come and dig and remember. Cuneiform was cracked open by a carving high on a cliff. The long silence of Mesopotamia was finally broken in modern times, when scholars set themselves to the daunting task of reading its forgotten writing. The great key was found upon a cliff in Persia, where an ancient king had ordered a long inscription carved high upon the rock, recording his deeds in 3 different languages, all written in cuneiform. A daring scholar climbed the dangerous cliff to copy the inscription, and because one of its languages could be understood, it offered a way to unravel the others, much as a bilingual stone had once unlocked the writing of Egypt. Slowly, sign by sign, the wedge-shaped script gave up its secrets, and the long-dead languages of Mesopotamia began to speak again. It was one of the great triumphs of scholarship, opening a window onto a world that had been lost for millennia. Suddenly, the anonymous mounds had names, and the silent clay tablets could tell their stories once more. A civilization that had been utterly forgotten was, letter by patient letter, brought back into the light. Beneath the desert, a library of clay still waits to be read. Though scholars have labored for many years, the story of Mesopotamia is far from fully told. Beneath the mounds of the ancient plain lie countless clay tablets, still buried in the earth. And even among those already dug up, a great many have never yet been read, waiting quietly in the drawers of museums for a scholar to study them. Each tablet may hold anything at all: a receipt, a letter, a prayer, a lost poem, a piece of forgotten history. Because clay endures so well, this vast library of the ancient world has survived where paper and parchment would long ago have rotted away. And new discoveries are made even now, adding fresh words to the oldest writing on earth. It is a wonderful thought to end upon, that the voices of Mesopotamia are not yet fully silent, that somewhere beneath the desert sand and in the quiet halls of museums, the ancient people of the 2 rivers are still waiting, patiently, to finish telling us their tale. As we come to the end of our journey, let us drift back one last time over the land between the rivers. We have watched the first farmers coax green fields from the silt and seen the first cities rise, Uruk and Eridu and crowded and alive beneath the wide and dusty sky. We have pressed the first words into wet clay and met the priestess Enheduanna, the first author to sign her name, and Taputi, who blended her perfumes in a palace long ago. We have wandered with Gilgamesh in search of a life that would not end, and gazed up with the patient stargazers of Babylon as they charted the wheeling planets and learned to foretell the darkening of the moon. We have passed beneath the glowing blue of the Ishtar Gate, stood before the great stone laws of Hammurabi, and listened to the golden lyres of and we have watched it all soften and fade at last, the cities melting back into the mud, the old gods slipping into silence, the mounds lying forgotten until, letter by patient letter, their voices were coaxed once more into the light. So much of the world we live in was first dreamed here, the written word, the wheel, the hours of our day, the very circle of the zodiac. And yet in the end, what lingers is something gentler than any invention. It is the image of ordinary people, tending their canals, sharing their bread and beer, teaching their children to shape the letters, and looking up, as we still do, at the same quiet stars. If you enjoyed this slow journey, you can support the channel by liking, subscribing, or leaving a comment. It helps these bedtime journeys find the people who need them. And if you are still awake, there will be another video waiting for you on the screen. But there is no need to reach for anything now. Let your jaw unclench, let your shoulders drop, let your breathing grow slow and deep, in and out, soft as a reed boat drifting downstream. The rivers are still flowing, the stars are still turning, and the ancient world is settling now into the dark. Sleep well and good night.